Hello, I'm Bhagat Oinam, and I'm continuing my lecture. This is the second part of my lecture on gender and some philosophical issues. Problem of gender and some philosophical issues. Uh, in this part of the lecture, I shall pick up a couple of conception from traditional Indian philosophy and then try to reflect, linking with the larger perspective that I have just set in my first lecture. Uh, if you remember, I was pleading that uh, it is improper to claim neutrality and universality while engaging with philosophical issues and conception, because there are certain values we are intellectually committed to, and we should not be shying away from accepting that I adhere with X or Y values. And feminist movement uh, precisely try to remind us that this is one way of showing our intellectual commitment to the political and civil rights issues relating to man and woman. Now, interestingly, in Indian tradition too, there is a clear explanation of the male and the female principles. It is not about the embodied man or embodied female, but Indian metaphysics. And by Indian metaphysics, I'm referring to Samkhya. And you all know that Vedanta itself is a later development from the larger philosophical theme that Sankhya took up. So the idea of the Purusha and Prakriti as male and the female principles are very interesting to look at. And one of my research scholars, my PhD scholar, work on this, the issues of gender in Sankhya philosophy. So I must also acknowledge that this is from the work of my student Sipra, that this issues has been picked up. Lots of debate took place within the community of scholars within my own center when this issue of gender in Sankhya philosophy was brought in. The resistance came from certain corners, from scholars, uh, primarily on the ground, and that also is a very significant ground. That is why I wish to uh, bring out the debate that took place within the Center for Philosophy among my colleagues as a part of this deliberation, because that itself is an interesting problematization that we uh, can reflect on to. Not that all of you have to agree with what me and my student took up. Is that the challenge of using the word gender in Sankhya philosophy is that gender is a very political and pragmatic, ideologically rooted conception, which can be understood in our day to day experiences, in our political sphere of life, and not necessarily in the metaphysical domain. And particularly, Sankhya as a metaphysical school of thought was certainly not interested in engaging with the politics or issues of rights of the man and woman in the actual day-to-day life experiences. But Sankhya was talking about a larger problems of principles, the male and the female principles. So bringing in the issue of gender, which is closely linked with the issues of rights and recognition, social recognitions and rights, is misplaced. So the issue of gender must not come in the debate in metaphysics, particularly when the debate is on bringing out the male and the female principle in the world of creation, the cosmology that you can talk about. So the challenge now is, should we bring in gender in the study of metaphysics? So far as metaphysical binary principles of Sankhya is concerned, there is no debate. Everyone who reads Sankhya knows it well, that it is about certain forces of nature, the primeval forces of creation that the male and the female represents. And this you will find in many traditions. In the Chinese tradition also, yin and yang is male and female principles. Even in my own indigenous uh, uh, philosophical traditions among the Manipuris, the question of P and Pa, the Pa is a female, a male, and P is a female. So that every creation is impossible without the union of the male and the female principles. So it is not about man and woman, but the forces which is feminine and forces which is masculine. And I think it's a beautiful conception that human beings across traditions have thought through. Of course, there are variables when they start narrating, telling stories about these creation myths. In the case of Sankhya, we know it well that the male principles is supposed to be transient, illuminating, but physically inactive. And you give the role of actions, role of flux, role of movement to the female principles. One is intelligent but inactive, another is non intelligent but active. Now, one may disagree onto this. Many feminists may start disagreeing that what kind of a binary is this and privileging one over the other. And we know that in Sankhya philosophy, whether you like it or not, this is my, I may be completely wrong, but my presumption is at the end of the day, it is the primacy of the Purusha over the Prakriti. Of course, the creation cannot happen without Prakriti, but the intelligence, which is the hallmark of the life, is bestowed on the male principle. But it also recognizes that one principle stand alone cannot suffice the entire creation. The creation itself requires the union of the male and female principles. To this, I think there will be very little disagreement among scholars. Now, the problem comes when you start explaining these metaphysical positions. This binary metaphysical principle of male and female, which the Sankhya holds, ultimately has to be translated through language. Without language, we cannot communicate. How will this philosophy at all be communicated to the others, to the rest? Only through language, only through storytelling. I call philosophy as a storytelling. Now, this narration through language requires using of words, parts of speech, common noun, proper noun, adjectives, and so on, without which you cannot explain the intricacies that exist in this philosophical articulations. So, what happens is that when you explain the Purusha through language, and this language has to be through Sanskrit in this case, and when you explain the Prakriti, you start using idioms, vocabulary from your everyday life, because the language that are being used are from our ordinary language. They are, I mean, how many times can we use artificial language? Purusha and Prakriti are, in a sense, artificial language, because you try to define them, give them connotation of certain kind, and give a characteristics of a proper name to Prakriti and Purusha. You define them in a particular intellectual way. Whereas explanation of what is Prakriti requires vocabulary of the language which you use in your everyday life. So what happens is that when they explain what is Prakriti, it is also called as Valika, the young maid, a girl child. Sometimes it has been used as dancer, nartaki, a dancer. Because who is a dancer? One who moves, one who is in motion. And one dances for the pleasure of somebody else. Look at this. Another word that is used is kshetra. Now, kshetra is one can use it as a land, fertile land, which, after all, if you have to grow agricultural crops, you have a land which is kshetra, but you have to plow it. So, plowing is symbolic to many activities, that female has to be plowed. This kshetra is to be made productive. So it is through this kshetra that the creativity is supposed to begin. Now, these terminologies that we use, whether it is nartaki, kshetra, valika, such conception which is from ordinary language, within the language called Sanskrit, itself tells us that these common nouns carry certain meanings, certain values. And we can see that the gendering, knowingly or unknowingly, is reflected in the very use of these terms. So the challenge my and my students' positioning is not on the principle per se. The richness of the metaphysical binary principles of Purusha Prakriti is very well taken. But explanation of these concepts, which I call artificial language, through ordinary language, through the terms like Kshetra, Nartaki, or Valika, itself suggests that there are certain ways of valuing which we bestow, certain meaning that we give to what you call the female principle. So, female principle, when explained, is through ordinary language, and that ordinary language carry meanings and values which are not free from gendering. So there are certain gendering of prakriti as the philosopher or philosophical texts start explaining. Now, this is a position that I would like to hold, that there are elements of gendering in explanation, in usages, in the narrative, not on the principle per se. But that principle requires narratives, and those narratives, once it use the ordinary language, starts carrying the meanings, values associated with gender distinction. Where are hierarchies, approval, disapproval, recognition, non-recognition, all these issues comes up. Now, I repeat, by this, under no circumstances, I am saying that Indian philosophy is gender biased. I am not at all saying this. But I would like to submit that there are several textual study that can be done where the issues of gender is being brought out both in terms of hierarchy as well as on parallel union of the male and female principle. Yet the issue of gender, not in terms of politics, but in terms of gender as two principles, are being articulated. I will give another example, not from Sankhya anymore, but the very conception which is most often used in all the classical dance drama. When you see, whether it is in the Bharatnatyam or it is in Kathak, Odissi, or any other classical dances, the Natya that you see along with Nritya, you also see often this is depicted by the dancer. You see this conception of Ardhanarishwara, the half male and half female. And this mythic figure associated with Shiva and Parvati is yet again a beautiful articulation of inseparability of the male and the female principles. And stand alone, a singular principle cannot suffice the whole meaning of existence. So I would like to submit here that while in some texts like Sankhya, you see gendering, hierarchizing to some extent, but in many other texts, again you find not necessarily a hierarchy, but more about inseparability of two dual principle. It is a binary principle which can be distinguished but inseparable. One can distinguish the male principle conceptually from the female principles, which Sankhya has done. But these two principles cannot be separated if we have to talk about existence. And Ardhanarishwara is one clear mythic figure in Indian philosophical tradition, which represents the inseparability of the male and the female principles, while recognizing human, or why only human? Recognizing existence per se, existence in the most broadest possible way. So I am not subscribing or prescribing this view that, gender hierarchy and exploitation exist in every Indian philosophical traditions. No. But I'm saying that the principles of the male and female, at certain context, there is tendency to draw hierarchy between male and female principles. And that is reflected when the description of these principles comes through our ordinary language. That is one submission. But having said that, I am of the view that the question of gender must not always be seen in the way it is done in the West. In the West, it is very clear that we have already discussed in the first part of my lecture, and which you already know about the movements, series of movements that has comes as waves, first wave, second, third, fourth waves. And in each of these waves, there are always certain grievances associated. It is always about filling up something which is not yet given. So it is all about the margin striking the center, the forces of the margin trying to claim certain things from the center. I would like to uh, picturize it like this. Whereas my submission is that gender need not, even though the term gender might have come from the West, it is not necessary that we have to always see it as a political rights movement. It is not necessary that we have to all the time see gender as hierarchy. But maybe we can see gender as a mark of differentiation between sexes, and yet recognize the inseparability of the two. And of course, these days, there are many more movements, bisexuality, which even begin from the third wave and continuing till the fourth wave. We are aware of that, what is happening in the West. But my submission is that we can still think of, through reading of the Indian traditions and philosophical texts, that gender is recognition of plurality of sexuality, and that sexuality gets reflected in terms of principles. But these principles need not be seen in isolation. Existence of the one cannot be possible without the existence of the other. In fact, I would say the very idea of existence is impossible without the union of the male and the female principles. Sometimes there may be hierarchy, sometimes there may not be. So there is no universality in terms of defining or explaining it. But the inseparability of the two principles and existence being built on the union of this plurality is something that we can learn from Indian philosophical tradition. And perhaps that is how we can also move. Now, the possible challenges that can come to me is that uh, this is a very biased reading, but my submission is that we should keep it open-ended and engage with these concepts more and more. And I will end for today because time doesn't permit anymore. Thank you.